Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar Creating Risk Assessments with Community. My name is Lana Woolf from Community Powered Responses, and firstly I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's webinar is about creating risk assessments with community. And the objectives of today's webinar is really asking the questions, why co-create risk assessments? And how do we co-create risk assessments? The purpose of a risk assessment, so we're told, and the general knowledge is to systematically identify the risks associated with a task, activity, or process, and put appropriate controls in place to eliminate or reduce those risks. It's an incredibly important function within the aid system, within international development, or humanitarian contexts with programs, with projects. But what we'll be talking about today is that it's not as simple as filling in a risk assessment form, particularly when we're taking a participatory approach and we're talking about the inclusion of underrepresented communities, such as with women, with people with disabilities, and with people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, expressions, and sex characteristics. So why do we co-create, or why do I co-create risk assessments? There's a lot of reasons to do that. But first of all, I wanted to share a personal story about preparing for bushfire season. I lived in a little tiny town called Buxton for a few years previously. And that small tiny town was a mere 10 kilometres from Marysville, which was kind of the epicentre of the Black Saturday bushfires in 2011 in Victoria. And it created such an impact in community that each year the local community members, and myself included, would go down to the local country fire authority and do a bit of a workshop on preparing for bushfire season. It was really incredibly important because we were all in a place that was designated as a risk. And in that process, we would have, the fire chief or people with extraordinary technical experience teaching us how to prepare for bushfire season and what to do if a fire came. And it was all very practical. And I remember this one part in it where they said, if you get trapped and you get stuck, simply just drive into the middle of a field, turn everything off in the car, put a blanket over you. And that was the absolute worst case scenario. And there was no guarantees, but that's what you were to do. And one person from the community who hadn't lived through the Black Saturday fires said, what if we go down to this local place in the community, it's where 3 different rivers meet, and we go there because of the water. And the police chief said, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I've never been to the river in the middle of a huge bushfire, but yeah, that sounds like a good idea. That could be an alternative to driving in the middle of the field and putting a woolen blanket over your head. And a local who had lived through the Black Saturday bushfires, who had lived in the community for many, many, many years, and who had been trapped during the Black Saturday fires, said, well, I attempted to do that during the Black Saturday fires. However, when I got there, there were animals, all of the deer that were wild in the area, kangaroos. The river had all sorts of things, snakes and all sorts of things in there. And so I quickly left, realizing that it's a really unsafe place to be, that there were really distressed animals, and it created an additional risk. And it reminded me the importance of the lived experience of living through a particular incident or a particular hazard. And that the fire chief in this case went, oh, I had never considered that, because I have a particular thought, I have particular training. I'm not at the river in a bushfire. I'm on the front lines fighting the fire. And it was only the lived experience of those not fighting bushfires, but living through that were able to share that knowledge and that experience with us about what might be a good mitigation strategy and what isn't a good mitigation strategy, and acknowledging that often it is people that live in communities that experience these things that have learnt their own mitigation strategies and learnt through trial and error. And I guess I wanted to start this story off because what we will be talking about today is the importance of the lived experience of community members, acknowledging that they navigate through risk every day and they've developed their own mitigation strategies, and that they're just as important or as technical experience that we as aid practitioners have. So why do we co-create? Because risk assessments often reinforce power relations, and it's essential to work towards shared power. That's something that we've been talking about a lot in the aid sector. But of course, this is something that is extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily, in my opinion, rare. Risk assessments usually focus on a group of individuals, while the impact, the harm often is collective, and it extends beyond the group into the community. Risk assessments can be colonialist, imposing ideas of vulnerability, risk, and mitigation that do not hold the range and complexity of people's and communities' lived experience. And I guess it's really important for us to have, as aid practitioners, a clear understanding of the concepts of duty of care and dignity of risk. And just really quickly, dignity of risk is a principle that really came through disability movement. And it's the idea that self-determination and the right to take reasonable risks are essential for dignity and self-esteem, and should not be impeded by excessively cautious caregivers or practitioners concerned with their duty of care. And this is really important, particularly when we're talking about international development programs and projects, where we do have an extraordinary amount of power, and we're often designing programs or projects and implementing them in ways that are really top down and telling people what they can and can't do because of our duty of care, without considering their dignity of risk. Particularly in international development programs, my thoughts are that communities and individuals in the communities, they're the ones that have the most to gain from our development projects in terms of rejuvenating communities, but also the most to lose when those projects go wrong or they're not successful or things happen. So based on that, how do we co-create risk assessments? And I want to tell another really quick story about the warrior of Ruteng. a community that I worked with for about 5 years on a water sanitation and hygiene project, and talk about the process that I went through with them, or walked alongside them with and facilitated with them on developing risk assessments. I guess the context in this case is that people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities are increasingly discriminated and stigmatized and criminalized in Indonesia. There's been new criminal laws recently. But through this project, we had a change of government in Indonesia, and we had a lot of people, I guess, really considering duty of care with the wider community about what risks would be in place or potentially happening in the project. And therefore, a risk assessment was developed before we even went there, while the project was being designed, before we had met with community, ascertaining what risks and what risk mitigation strategies we had to put into play, with this understanding of the discrimination and stigma and increasing criminalization of people with diverse genders in Indonesia. And so there was all of these really restrictive mitigation strategies, working at night time, not allowing the project to be public, many things like that, where when working with the community, they wanted to advocate for their dignity and rights around accessing safe, accessible and inclusive water sanitation and hygiene. The particular local context was that they felt risk mitigation strategies would be involving government officials, would be involving police and other people in positions of power that they actually had a reasonably good relationship with. And so from a top-down approach, the risk mitigation was quite different to the lived experience, and the mitigation strategies were ones that were completely oppositional to, I guess, the risk assessment in the first place. The mitigation strategies that they came up with were actually the things that we thought were really risky. When I say we, the project designers and so forth, and I guess the funding body. And so this short story is really about saying that particular contexts are very different, even within countries or regions, and that this is one of the reasons why we need to co-create risk assessments. So how did I develop a risk assessment with community members? And I'm going to show you today 2 different exercises that I facilitate. And the first one is a what if activity. And a what if activity is really, in this case, a very simple diagram, as you can see on the screen, on butcher's paper. And it's about thinking about, well, what if these things happen? What if those things happen? And have a really kind of good discussion with the community. So in this example, an example that's pretty common within the aid sector, we're considering funding to sustain the project and the outcome of an upcoming election, and considering these as both factors that have high impacts on projects and the communities, and they're currently really hard to predict. When we're in that situation, when an election coming on, we're considering funding, we don't know what's going to happen. It's usually something that's really talked about in aid organisations and really thought about in that context of the aid organisation and the sustainability of projects and the sustainability of the organisation's funding, with really little consideration of, well, what happens to the community if we can't continue projects or we can't get additional funding? What happens to long-term work that we've been doing? And what happens to the relationship if we can no longer work there? And so again, these things really impact the communities that we work with. And so if we're really genuinely talking about co-design, if we're really talking about inclusion and participation, we need to be having those conversations with the local community members as well. And so this diagram, where we can develop a list of key factors that may have a high impact and are difficult to predict, and selecting in this case, and you can do many versions of this for the same project or the same program or the same team. And in this case, selecting the 2 factors that have the highest impact and the most difficult to predict. And then talking with the community about the impact of each scenario and what the possible outcomes are when they're combined. And discuss the possible impact of each scenario. And to make it a little bit more inclusive or have reasonable accommodations. I've done this with people who are blind or have low vision, and so making it tactile, using a small stylus to use Braille on sticky notes, or if people may be unable to write, using pictures and symbols. And so we can have a really genuine discussion about what we think the impacts are. And so this is one of the 2 activities I want to show you. This is the what if activity. And again, this is just an example, so you can work with the community. They can, together create that list of key factors and decide what it is that you want to be doing this activity on. So I'm going to share another little story. And this one is not one that I was personally involved in, but it was one that was shared with me in a training that I facilitated. And it was a large INGO that were working with women in Bangladesh. And it was about eliminating women participating in sex work. And the idea behind it was that sex work is something that is oppressive to women, and that we should, in all cases, create situations where women weren't doing sex work. It's a highly delicate topic, I think, because we don't want to moralize about sex work, but certainly there are varying levels of risk, particularly when we look at the different types of sex work that women do. And when women are coerced into sex, it's not sex work, it's exploitation, just to make a note on that. So this project went ahead and it kind of worked with women to move them out of the sex work trade into factories. What happened was that this was a very top-down project, and that in this instance, what ended up happening was that, yes, women stopped sex work, and yes, they moved into factories, but because they earned substantially less, they ended up then taking their children out of school, and their children became factory workers so that the family income could remain at a rate similar to when the women were engaging in sex work. And this is an example of a really top-down approach and really not thinking about what the impact in families and communities are with different projects and programs that we undertake. And so again, it's about thinking about how do we develop risk assessments, thinking about possible outcomes that are more based on people's lived experience in particular local contexts than what we can assume sitting behind a desk in a global north, global minority country. And so this is how I've done many, many, many risk assessments with community members or with participants in particular projects or workshops. And again, it's a very, very simple diagram. And we choose a particular topic, and there could be very many. And so again, you might have several of these, or you might break the group up into smaller groups to focus on a particular part of risk. Say, for example, one part might be risk to children, another part might be risk to women, or another part might be about risks in engaging a particular advocacy strategy, so on and so forth. So you really need to adapt it to what you're focusing on in your local context. But it's really about placing on here low likelihood of risk to high likelihood of risk, and high level of risk to low level of risk, and thinking about, what is it at the current space, and what kind of mitigation strategies do people already have to move their sticky notes, in this case, down to low likelihood of risk and low level of risk. And again, thinking about inclusion tips for those who are illiterate. They can draw pictures or maybe ask a participant to scribe, making it tactile for those who are blind or have low vision, and use a braille with small stylus for those that read braille. And I've done this many times with many different types of communities, including women, people with disabilities, and people with diverse SOGIESC. What's really interesting about this is that giving people the space to talk about their own mitigation strategies. And people do have mitigation strategies. Often we can strengthen mitigation strategies. Often we can use our positions of power to think about what other types of strategies that we can use with the power and the resources that we have, but really building on the innate strength of the community and the mitigation strategies that they had already developed over extraordinarily long periods of time, often over their own lifetimes or over many lifetimes if mitigation strategies have been passed on through communities. They've been able to learn what works and what doesn't work, what they can strengthen themselves. And so this is a really, really easy way that we can involve many people in developing or co-creating risk assessments and risk mitigation strategies. And of course, because of funding and donors and standards and requirements, often we need to translate it into a risk assessment that is more familiar to the aid system. But there's nothing to say that we also can't teach people who have not become familiar with those particular documents to then translate this into that kind of document as well. And so, again, it's just really actually incredibly simple. Again, I've used butcher's paper and pens and sticky notes. People have drawn pictures or people have talked, and we've had scribes to really unpack and really allow people to take up space and to center their own lived experience and take leadership in their own communities and feel like they actually own the projects that they're in that are meant to support them in their communities. And so it's just a very, very simple process. So I'm going to go back to the what if activity. So often I use them together. this is a great opportunity to say, what if this, what if that? And so from that, they can say, well, this is the likely scenario of there's no funds in different government. And then, well, if that's the case, if that government is a much more restrictive government, we don't have funds for this project, then what is the risk of, you know, the community, for example, I'm making things up here, of continuing their own advocacy without the support and the power of the INGO. And so then they can develop that strategy in the risk assessment. So this is very, very simple tools around co-creating risk assessments with communities. And again, I'm just going to go to the beginning and say that risk assessments often reinforce power relations. They don't have to. We can center communities. We can use their lived experience of operating in those communities, of navigating risk and developing risk mitigation strategies, of using people's strengths and supporting them and building on them, but also using our power as INGOs to support what they're already doing there and how they want to proceed. Risk assessments usually focus on a group of individuals. So for example, when we're doing risk assessments, we're usually talking about, risk mitigation strategy for, people under the age of 18. What do we need to do? Well, we need to have, child protection focal point. We need to ensure that all of the facilitators and staff have child protection, et cetera, et cetera. But what the impact of if things go wrong isn't just an impact to our organisation in those situations, but the harm is often collective and extends beyond the group. And so really engaging the community to be able to go, how do we keep, in this case, people under 18 engaged in the project, but also safe. And, they have a right to be able to be involved in this conversation and have their view and be able to use their strengths. Risk assessments can be colonialist, imposing ideas of vulnerability, risk and mitigation that do not hold the range and complexity of people's and communities' lived experience. And so really when we're talking about decolonization, part of that is not just working with governments or local country teams, but genuinely working with communities. I've never worked in a community where someone says, oh yeah, I'm a woman, I'm vulnerable. That is very much, I would be very offensive if I said that, for example. So taking a strengths-based approach and saying, you're the expert of yourself. You're the one that lives in this community. You know what you're doing. I'm here to support you. What is already in place? What strategies do you already have? What is the local context here, and how can we support you to build on that? And really clear understanding of the concepts of duty of care. We absolutely have a duty of care, but taking that rights-based approach, that duty of care is working alongside them to ensure that they're safe, but they can, in a project, take a dignity of risk approach, and that they can fulfill their rights to be able to say what is risk, what is not risk, what are mitigation strategies, what are not mitigation strategies, what level of risk do we believe is really important to ensure the success of this project, because, the aim of aid is to support communities to rejuvenate, and that's particularly important, and we're asking people to be engaged in this and to work alongside us to change people's communities for the better. And so they get to have a decision around what a dignity of risk approach looks like and what is enabling for them to be able to support and rejuvenate their communities. So there's the 2 activities. You can find these on communitypoweredresponses.com on my resources page. So www.communitypoweredresponses.com. And if you want to email me to find out more, or you're interested in working with me or doing training, you can email me at hello@communitypoweredresponses.com. And I realize I've made a mistake there. It's RESPONSES, communitypoweredresponses.com. Thank you very much. And we'll be taking a little break for December and January, but we'll be back in February for our next Unplugged webinar. Thank you.